All right, so this video is going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a famous French philosopher who has some very interesting things to say about education. And we're going to look at some excerpts from his book, Emile. And Emile is considered one of the masterpieces, one of the most important contributions to philosophy education in Western history. And he's interesting because he's going to take some positions that are very much different from that of the theorist who we just studied, which is John Locke. All right, so we talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this interesting Frenchman. He opens the book with a comment that probably rings as true today as it did in his time. He says, everybody knows that education is important, and everybody knows that ordinary education is bad. And, I'm thinking about this. I wonder how many ages, how many time periods, how many people in their lives, in their lifetimes, in human epics, have said the same comments. Education is critical, but our educational system is poor. It certainly is something that we say today, and it's interesting and worthwhile to note that Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that in his time, and I'm sure he was expressing an opinion that was held by many. So I wonder if we're always trying to strive for this ideal, this perfection with regard to education that we can never attain. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. And then Rousseau says, all right, a lot of people have talked about the fact that education is critical. A lot of people have talked about the fact that contemporary education is bad, but they don't offer a plan. So he says, I'm going to offer you a plan. Now, it may not ultimately be realistic, but we want to try to approach as close to that plan as possible. And he starts with this idea, with the idea of nature versus nurture. So he wants to talk about, well, what is the ultimate source of our character, of moral values, of our knowledge? And he is someone who's very consistently a critic of society. He thinks society does not edify and discipline and cultivate us and civilize us. That view would essentially say that society is good. Society brings us out from a savage and ignorant, an impulsive, a very rudimentary state, and brings us up, helps us develop, helps us become fully human, fully rational. Rousseau takes the opposite perspective. He says our natural state is better than the state that we've come to be in civilization, and that civilization corrupts us. And it is an influence that harms us. And so a central part of his educational theory is going to be to try to remove as much as possible this child from civilization, to put the child as much as possible back in their natural state. He says, look, I can't do this completely, and I can't just simply leave them out of society in today's day and age because it's constructed in such a way that if I did that, the child would suffer. But the ideal is to remove social influences as much as possible from the child and let the child be natural. So remember that when I start talking in a few minutes about his specific plans with regard to how to educate. He also says, just kind of another component, another element of his thinking. He says that there are three sources for education. And those sources are biology, instruction from teachers and others, and then experience with the world. And he argues that the problem is when one of these sources conflicts with the other. And he says that is what often happens. He does say, look, we have inclinations that can't be completely transformed by habit. They can be altered. They can be influenced, but they can't be completely altered. And one other kind of side note, or interesting tidbit from the reading before I get into the heart of his educational theory, is he says that training for being a part of civilization usually involves training for a specific element of that civilization. To be a professor, to be an education person, to be a teacher, to be an engineer, to be a nurse, to be a politician, to be a sports figure, whatever it is. Usually, in terms of education, we're trained to perform a specific function within this broader social context. But he says one of the problems with that view is that it removes or diminishes or doesn't allow us to focus on that which makes us human, that which is common to all. And so Rousseau says, look, I'm not interested in training someone to fulfill a certain role in society. I am interested in training someone to be human. And again, remember I talked about this a little bit before. For him to be human is to remove as much as possible the social influence. Okay, so let's talk about his core educational philosophy when it comes to young children, because that's what he's going to focus on, and that's what Locke focused on as well. And essentially, what he wants is the child to develop according to its natural inclinations. The child should not submit, should not be forced to alter, should not be forced to deny his or her inclinations for the sake of reason or for the sake of the parent's schedule or for the sake of what the child is supposed to be doing at this age, if we kind of looked at it in contemporary language. No, the freedom of the child to develop as a child, as he or she naturally would, is the basic core principle for Rousseau when it comes to education. He's going to say that discipline is not the key here. Reason is not the key here. The child's ability to follow their inclinations and their desires and their curiosities, that is what must be at the center of any education when it comes to young children. Okay, again, the key principle, the key advice, the key rule that Rousseau will use when it comes to, well, what does it mean to educate a young child, is to let that child explore and follow his or her inclinations as much as possible. And then he says, okay, well, if the ultimate goal here is freedom, and freedom is an essential principle of his philosophy, what does freedom mean? And he says, freedom is the ability to want only what one can get and to do only what pleases oneself. And then happiness comes with the equality between power and our will. In other words, happiness is the ability to get what we want. But remember, he said that true freedom is not wanting what you can't get, not wanting the impossible, not wanting what you'll never have, but wanting what you can get. And so for him, freedom isn't this idea that you can do whatever you can imagine, whatever you dream of, whatever you desire. No, freedom is the ability to kind of look at your abilities, your capacities, your environment, and say, well, in this environment, with these capacities and with these abilities, and with this training, with this knowledge, here's what I can get. And so essentially that is freedom. It is, this is a bit of an aside, but a somewhat stoic version of freedom. Only want what you can get. And if you can't get it, if you can't attain it, don't worry about it. Because that'll just make you unhappy and jealous and bitter. Okay, so when we talk about this, if the idea is to attain freedom and to let the child be free, and the idea is for freedom to describe a state in which you can only want what you can get, and that you can indeed go out and do it and get what you want, well, then how does that apply to the child? And so the first thing he's going to say is, look, love the kid, love their childish play, love their innocence. Don't try to, enforce a strict discipline on them. Let them be a kid. 2, he says you've got a part of this, and this is, very much connected, is you've got to recognize that the child and the adult are at different places in life. He says the child is not a young adult. The child is a child. The child is different. The child views the world differently. The child thinks about the world differently. The child interacts with the world differently. And so he says, don't attempt to reason with the child because the child isn't ready to be reasoned with. The end result of education is a reasonable human being, but you can't presume, you can't assume reason at the very beginning. The third point, he says, and this is where it kind of gets fun to look at his theory, do not forbid the child anything, but let the child's natural incapacities be the reason that he or she cannot satisfy his or her desires. So don't say, you can't do this. Say, okay, if you want it, go out and try to get it. And if the child is incapable, well, then the child has failed, not because you have restricted the child, not because you have imposed your will on the child, but because the child simply doesn't have the power or the ability or the knowledge. And Rousseau brings up a really kind of fascinating example, a number of examples to help support his point. One of those examples, he says, don't teach the child magic words, such as please and thank you. Well, maybe you can say thank you, but certainly not please. Don't tell the child, well, you have to ask please. Just say please. And he says the reason that you shouldn't train a child to fulfill his or her desire by saying please is because then the child thinks that please is a magic word. And that just by saying this magic word, he can get or she can get what he or she wants. It transforms reality into a place where you just say this word and you get what you desire. And so Rousseau makes that very interesting point by saying, look, I'd rather the child be rude than believe that by just saying these words, he or she can attain what he or she desires. He's very much against giving the child whatever he or she wants, but it's not because, like Locke, the idea is to discipline, the idea is to control your inclinations, control your urges. The idea here is simply that if you give the child whatever they want, again, they'll develop this idea that anything is possible. All they have to do is ask. And Rousseau has this beautiful, interesting, fascinating passage where he says, if you promise the child this, the next thing he'll want is the stars, and the next thing he'll want is the moon. And, eventually, this is a problem because, one, the parent can't provide the child with all this stuff. The parent doesn't have the resources. And two, it again transforms reality into something where the child simply has to ask for something and he or she receives it. And so Rousseau says, look, we don't want to do that. We want the child to experience the world as it is naturally, where you only get what you want if you have the ability and the capacity to attain it, not because you say something and the world succumbs, fulfills your desire. He says it's a perversion of order when the child thinks that it is in charge, when the child thinks that it is in control. He says, no, that is not natural. What is natural is for the parent to be in control and to be obeyed. Although, again, there's some contradictions and tensions in Rousseau's thought, because on the other hand, he says, let the child do what he or she wants. But essentially, he says, look, the child isn't in control. The child's not the boss. The parent is the boss. The fourth point, and this is connected to the other three as well, he says, let experience rather than command be the prohibition and the punishment. So he says, don't tell your child, don't do this or you'll be in trouble. Let the child do essentially what he or she wants. And if there are bad consequences with that action, then so be it. So, for example, and again, he gives some really interesting case studies here. He talks about the children playing out in the cold. And he says, a lot of times kids will be out there in the cold and they'll start to get, shiver, and they'll start to turn blue, and the parent will go out there and force them to come in, or, make them wear an extra glove or make them wear an extra hat. And, Rousseau says, forget it. Let the child get cold. When the child is cold enough, when the child is feeling sick, when the child is freezing, then the child will come in. And instead of, being bitter and, resentful of the parent using his or her authority over the child, essentially the child will recognize, look, if it's cold, I got to come inside. And the child will learn much more from that experience than if you simply tell the child this is what you have to do. Another example, he says, look, imagine a child breaks a window, throws a rock or something, the window breaks. What do? He says, well, you could go up there and fix it. You could go up there and yell at the child. But he says, no. Let the wind blow in that night. Let the child get cold. Let the child recognize that the consequences of her actions, or his actions, in this case, are bad. And that's the best way, if you want to teach a child, not to do something. Because the child will say, look, I don't want to be freezing. I don't want to be cold. And so I'm not going to throw a rock through the window. And so the child learns the consequences of his or her action. And in this way, Rousseau says, the child also learns the importance of property, learns the importance of not breaking things that are his or her, or other people's things, because the breaking of that property, the ruining, the destruction of that property can have bad consequences. And again, you're not teaching the child morality. The child doesn't understand morality. The child doesn't understand why certain things are right and why certain things are wrong. But the child, from experience, will very much learn that he shouldn't break a window. Not because it violates some right, or not because you're doing something that you ought not to do. That you didn't have a right to throw the rock through this window. The child will learn because the consequences are bad. Finally, a last kind of example, he talks about a tantrum. And Rousseau says, look, tantrums are not to be taught with punishment or kind of addressed with punishment. Let the kid get his tantrum out and then talk about it as being a kind of a form of madness, a form of craziness. And if the child drives you into a wall and you get so angry and upset that you yell at the child or that you have a kind of a fit of anger, he says, tell the child, look, you drove me to become temporarily insane, essentially. I was out of my wits. So instead of kind of saying, no, don't do that, child, or make a huge deal about it, let the child have his or her tantrum, but then, essentially tell the child that is madness, that is craziness. And if you see somebody else do it, or if you yourself do it, identify that as craziness or madness. So again, so we look at Rousseau. Some of the key elements of his philosophy are that one, that nature is good. Our natural state is ideal. So we want to let children develop as naturally as possible. And part of what that means is letting the child, actually essential component of what that means, is letting the child follow his or her inclinations, his or her desires, giving him or her the freedom to do that, not restricting the child, not telling the child no, but then letting experience and the consequences of the child's actions be that child's educator. And instead of imposing, instead of restricting, you let the child learn through experience.